with this round of applause. And over to them now for this next session on what's next for mobility, a global and an Indian perspective.
So, good evening, everybody. A tough act to follow, the Prime Minister. But the good thing is he brought a big crowd back late in the day, so thank you for that. Good evening, my name is Christian, as mentioned. We are very happy to talk to you about mobility and you will excuse for a adolescent joke, and frogs. And you might find out in a minute what we mean by that. So we will run this session in a bit of a interactive way between Anshuman and myself. The theme of this conference is what's next. In mobility, we find that we need to give a bit of a nuanced view. So we will explain and give some views, not a comprehensive view, but at least a potpourri of themes of what is next for mobility globally. And then Anshuman will reflect and say what it means for India. Want to say another intro word? All right. So we will structure this discussion to say what is next for mobility within cities and then between cities to describe these ecosystems. So we'll start with the view of what is next in mobility within cities. So what are the challenges that mobility has in cities? The first one is congestion. And obviously, this city, this part of the world is not a stranger in that regard, but actually many places are not a stranger in that regard. So cities battle with congestion significantly. You will see that some things are going to make it a bit better, some are going to make it a bit worse. What you see here is in the city of Istanbul is actually one of the most congested cities in the world with 100 hours of traffic per person per year lost. If everybody during this time worked, which might necessarily not be true, but let's assume, that will be a huge GDP impact of 200 billion for Turkey. Now, the other thing is public transit systems, despite many of their improvements, also maybe are not working perfectly. One statistics to show that is we actually still yet to recover the ridership of pre-pandemic years. And that, of course, has also to do with the ways of working. But also, there is a reason, we can still make the systems better. Now, if we go on, let's say, one of the reasons to make public systems better is the shared, connected mobility ecosystems. You would assume that this is done around the world in a very integrated way and everything is figured out. Now, even in London, which you could consider one of the best-in-class examples in the world, there is still a lot of things that are quite fragmented. They don't provide an integrated service. You see some examples here. The national railway services, you cannot get the same tickets, micromobility, even some of the train services. And then funding is obviously a key problem. Many cities in the world struggle. The cities have been pushed in finding other sources of revenue. What you can see here is just one, I think, quite clear example in Lagos, in Nigeria. There is the actual need for public transport, CAPEX is 50 billion, whereas they get only 1 billion. And there is a huge disparity, and of course in other cities it's maybe less, but to prove the point. So what has happened in the world to pick up on some of these challenges as a selection? So the first one, many cities have actually looked not necessarily first solving the efficiency of transport and mobility, it was to reduce the demand. So a quite recent example, you might have followed the press in New York, has been congestion charging. So congestion charging does nothing else than basically limit demand. So before the service starts, fewer people use it. You can see some historic examples here. Singapore was the first one, Stockholm, London are famous examples where, with a charge of going into the inner city, traffic levels have reduced significantly. New York has started showing some of that, and now there's obviously the legal battle with the new administration coming in. This is one way of cities to reduce demand. Others have, for example, also looked at reducing road capacity and thereby pushing people in public transport modes. And a very interesting development, it's not fully clear what it really means, is autonomous driving and robotaxis. There's been a few places in the world that have far progressed. One of them is China, actually. The other one is San Francisco. You might have followed, maybe many of you might have been in San Francisco. Waymo is a company that was, its investment over 15 billion dollars so far over the years, and there the system works pretty well now. It's a bit unclear. What does it mean for public transport? Does it mean more cars on the roads? It might. So not necessarily clear how cities will react to that. Maybe one more trend. Inner city freight is also a topic. There's a lot of movements happening at the same time. It causes some of the congestion as well. So some cities have looked into organizing it, orchestrating it a bit better. There's, for example, some initiatives in London around having joint freight consolidation. There is in New York, there is a tendency, an attempt to not have deliveries during peak hours. There are also drone deliveries and so on. And maybe the last one before I hand over, digital integration of apps, I would say, is also progressing, and systems are getting better and better. So with this, maybe I pass the word to my colleague Anshuman to reflect on a few of these topics and how they play out in India. Not all of them do.
Yeah. Thank you, Christian. So as part of my portfolio of work, I actually do work a lot with Government of India, specifically the Ministry of Roads. And we do realize that many of these issues that have been highlighted in the global context are almost equally applicable to India, and some of them are probably a little bit more teething in our case. So I want to reflect upon some of those, and then we'll talk about a little bit about where we kind of go from here, right? So starting first with, sorry.
Just skip it this one.
Yeah, I think the fact that in general, the quality of congestion, the quality of traffic management, it's a well-known phenomenon in our cities. Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, most of them have upwards of 600 to 700 cars for every kilometer of road, which is only so much that can be accommodated, and more keep getting added every day, which is a large challenge that we continue to have. In terms of regulatory aspects, obviously the last few years, cab hailing has been probably the single biggest game changer as far as public transport, or at least a shared public transport, is concerned. But just given the federal nature of our decision making, transport is a concurrent subject. So central government frames the rules, but ultimately the implementation happens at the level of the states as well as the cities. So how should there be a common framework covering cab aggregation? What regulatory guidelines it gets covered. So again, while MV Act, which is a mother act that governs all of these, set some guidelines, but there's still a lot of lack of clarity in terms of the way it actually gets administered on the ground, which means that the passenger experience, you or anyone else, will never have a uniform experience of using some of these in Delhi versus Bangalore versus, let's say, Bhubaneswar, right? So that's the second aspect in terms of getting some of these regulatory things in play. The third aspect is around the fact that the urban freight networks are actually quite fragmented. And part of it is also a behavior that, all of us have gotten used to in the last 3-4 years, perhaps. The rise of quick commerce, the gig economy, e-commerce deliveries. It's all a very fragmented, both from an employment side as well as very fragmented from a vehicle utilization side. So that again leads to challenges around how best is freight delivered in the context of our cities. And more importantly, what that leads to from a mobility and congestion answers for the cities. And lastly, ultimately EVs are here to stay. All of us, many of us are users as well. The biggest issue we see is also just the pace of the rollout for the charging. So while again there are different states have taken different approaches. Maharashtra, for example, is one of those states which is really amping up its aspect of having much more right now. But again, the fact remains that at a federal level also, it's not very clear who should drive this mandate. Is it Ministry of Roads? Is it Ministry of Heavy Industries? Ministry of Power has a say, as well as Ministry of MNRE, which is the renewables. So we do see that some of these challenges, while common across the world, have very unique, I would say, Indian flavor. But still need to be addressed in the confines of our decision making and our financial abilities of the way our governments are. Okay. And a couple of things to talk about what we are seeing here. I think first is the fact that obviously Delhi Metro is a prime shining example of the quality of infra, but also Bangalore, also coming up in many smaller cities in the UP. Examples like, on electric buses, there is a lot of thrust for public transport. So through the PM E-Seva, it's close to 3,500 crores, about $400 million is getting spent in actually funding many of these buses. And these buses will actually start to come online in another 5 years or so. That changes the game quite a lot, given the type of, unlike the SRTUs, what get handled here. Similarly, drone-based deliveries, my colleague Christian also talked about this. We are beginning to see it happen in e-commerce context. And actually, India presents a great use case just given the congestion and a promise of delivery within, 10 minutes, 2 hours, 8 hours, whatever it may be. So we are beginning to see pilots being done by multiple e-commerce companies, but also, most importantly, for medicine deliveries, which is probably where some of the biggest use case actually makes a lot of sense. And a fourth example that I want to touch upon is in terms of smart traffic. So much more AI-enabled dynamic application of red light, green lights at different places, dynamic lane management, because ultimately our cities have only so much infra. We are not going to get more infra than what exists, at least the highway side. So again, smart traffic and AI integration again enables just a lot more dynamic usage of traffic and in our roads. So that was a little bit of a quick overview on at least the India mobility that we see impacting elsewhere. Back to you, Christian.
We wanted to reflect on the other part of mobility that I mentioned earlier. We were first within cities, describing the urban ecosystem. Now let's look also at mobility between cities. So we will not talk about things that fly, but we'll talk about things that move on roads and on tracks. So railways, trucks, buses. So again, let's do the similar thing. Let's have a look at what are the trends, the challenges globally, and then let's have a look what of these is important in India. So global challenges. Now, obviously, high-speed rail is something that's quite hotly debated. It's been a trend over the last years. And different countries have tackled this mode of traveling differently. Some have really doubled down. Some are just trying and dabbling and looking for the first time at projects. But some of the countries that you see here are good examples of really doubling down. And you obviously know them. So what is interesting here is that in Japan, it's been a hugely successful system. But in China and Spain, arguably, there might have been an overshooting of the system. What happened is that for political reasons, the networks grew far too much. The revenue is not there. The maintenance cost becomes really an eternal legacy because all of these systems, the networks, the infrastructure was put in place, will have to be funded over a long time. So one of the questions is, in a high-speed system, do you do it? And what is the right extent? Do you go only for the most important routes? Do you go nationwide or do you overshoot? Decarbonizing is obviously on everybody's mind. I think even with the current, some of the administration's sustainability targets are there. For many countries, it's still quite high on the national agenda. Building railway networks that are electric comes at a huge cost. What you see here is a typical cost per track mile that might be different between countries. Again, one question that countries have to ask themselves is how much do they want to invest in electrification? Last one, in terms of the challenges, freight, also a matter of discussion for many countries. You see the modal share in these different countries shown below, and how much of freight traffic goes on rails. In North America, one of the best functioning markets in the world, is relatively high. Europe has been trying to deregulate and do a lot, still very low. I would say in some ways comparable to India that you can see here. So then what are some of the emerging trends? As mentioned, high-speed rail networks, difficult to get it right. Still a number of projects that are being built right now. In the Middle East, a number of them. In the US and California, it's been an ongoing discussion, might be canceled now. And still some projects in North Africa and Europe. Some countries have gone into electrification highly, many of them in Europe. Autonomous trucking is one of the big questions for the mobility industry. What it does, it brings the price point of long-distance delivery, transport, to a level that normally only rail existed. So in some cases, autonomous long-distance trucking might be an important competitor of rail freight. And then in some parts of the world, this long distance mode of transport as wheel-based is being even more innovative. For example, in Japan, between some major cities, they're in essence building a conveyor road or planning it. So I would maybe here with the global trends stop and the challenges and again pass it to Anshuman to talk about what it means for India.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think here there are some interesting changes from some of the trends that you talked about. For example, one of the things that I want to touch upon is the fact that of course there is a need for modernization of tracks. some of us who've traveled on trains recently do know that, close to 30 to 40% of our tracks are actually above the recommended lifespan, which means it's a maintenance issue as much as it's a safety issue. So they definitely need upgrades, which again needs financing, and what should be the plan for that. And at the same time, we need to continue building more. So there's always a choice between where the money is split between. The second, again, Christian pointed this out, just the fact that the freight that moves on road versus moves on rail. Actually, 50 years back, that number that used to move on rail was close to 50 to 60%. It's actually come down to 21. So in some ways, the preferred mode continues to shrink, which is always a shame. But it's a battle that world over freight networks are actually grappling with. But some interesting things that we see, the fact that DFCs, which are now almost fully operational after a long time, but and are also beginning to move high value added freight, right? So much more container traffic, trucks on trains, really nice models, and moving away from coal handling and handling of rice and wheat. So there's just a lot more value added stuff that starts to move on network and much faster, connecting our ports. Second, in terms of electrification, Christian, you touched upon this. India actually is pretty advanced on this. There's 95% of our tracks are fully electrified of broad gauge, and diesel is meant more for some more maintenance issues or short-term coverage. But this is one area where, at least from a fleet decarbonization point of view, we have in some ways leapfrogged maybe some of the other geographies as well. Third trend I want to talk about is in terms of long-distance buses. For the longest time, long-distance buses were the preserve of the SRTUs. Some of us, if you've traveled, there's the quality of experience really varies significantly depending on which part of the country you're traveling in. AC, non-AC, buses are working, not working, maintenance, SRTU saddled with debt, saddled with operational challenges. But the fact that there are new entrants in this space, Flixbus, for example, which is one of the largest of such operators, has announced its intent to start operating. Similarly, Intracity Smart Bus. So that gives hope that the intercity transport, which is actually the more profitable mode of transportation, unlike intracity where there are other challenges on tariff, it does make a difference to having long distance commutes done much more efficiently vis-a-vis cars, because the more cars go on the road, you just need to keep building highways for just as long as you need to. And the last one that I want to talk about is HSR, which Christian also started with. I think it's a priority for any developing nation to at least put a project in place, because the economic opportunities that get unlocked between the cities, as has been proven in case of Shinkansen and quite a few. And India is also in that place. In fact, Shinkansen is what will help us also get there with the E5 series.
All right. So now you might wonder, what are these idiots putting frogs here on the pages? I did mention frogs in the beginning. So what we want to introduce is a bit a hopeful note at the end of this discussion. So you might see from all of the challenges, it's all doom and gloom, but we did want to leave you with a note with a sense of a concept, which is leapfrogging. This is where the frog comes in, and I hope it stays in memory. So the question that we ask ourselves is, beyond all of the obstacles to be overcome, what are the things that India can do to maybe jump one challenge? Or what is it maybe particularly good at that could help it tackle what is next in mobility?
Yeah, so this is our moment to shine, what India can really do much better than the rest of the world. The first one, I think, is just the whole maturity and scale of our digital public infrastructure, which is payment systems, authentication systems, biometric devices. The number of use cases that ride on this in the context of transportation are immense. And ticketing is the simplest one of them, but anything that can speed up the movement of people, because face-based authentication is just so much faster. It's already happening at our airports through DigiYatra. It will happen in many of the other modes. So the whole backbone of our DPI just places us in a position where the use cases can just be unlocked very, very rapidly. The second, I mean, it's a well-known thing, so, and it's probably a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. It's just the depth of engineering talent, the depth of capabilities to work on some of these cutting-edge problems. In fact, it's e-commerce. E-commerce didn't originate in India, right? E-commerce originated in the US with Amazon. But on this day and age, the fastest and the cheapest delivery networks, and at the same time, companies being profitable, is only China, Indonesia, and India. Those are the only three countries where it's happened. Europe is struggling with delivery costs. US, of course, Amazon has its own struggle. So, and that's coming down to the ingenuity of the talent that actually makes many of these networks possible, that just makes a lot of real-time optimization doable. The third element I want to touch upon is financial innovation, and in some ways it's one of those things which, because you're in a situation where you have a little bit of a crunch, so you have to manage better. I think just the involvement of private sector in funding India's infrastructure is of a different league. I'll give you a statistic. Ever since the Bharatmala program, which is one of the things that I've been helping the Ministry of Roads with, has been, in the last 2 years, about 45% of the capital that has gone into building roads is actually private capital. Nowhere else in the world are roads built by private capital with the intensity that they get built in India. If all those roads were to be built by the Indian government, all that money would not go to health and education and other social protection that needs to be provided. So this level of financial innovation is what just unlocks so much more money. And once private capital comes in, obviously there is efficiency and other angles. So I would say these three areas, at least the way I see it from the outside, really add a lot to mobility. And we are already at a place where we are actually much ahead of many countries in the world. So it's just making sure that we keep latching onto it, keep building on top of it. And many of those solutions we will continue to be much better at as recently as the next 3-4 years. Okay. So with that, we'll bring this to a close. So thank you for listening to us. Thank you for patient hearing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for that very wonderful and interactive presentation. We all enjoyed it thoroughly. Well, we'll be joined by the Haryana Chief Minister in just a few minutes. It's going to be a while before he arrives here, about 10 minutes. In the meantime, we're going to make you go through some of the very interesting audio visuals that we've been showing you about the next conclave, what it entails. And we'll be right back in 10 minutes. It's not over. The Chief Minister of Haryana, Mr. Saini, is going to be here momentarily. We'll be right back.